Hello and welcome, I'm TC Lee, and today we're going to be talking about Ice Staves and Minor Brittle, and everything you need to know. What the Ice Staff does, we're going to talk about the Ice Staff versus the Lightning Staff, the perks and the skills that we get from the Frost Staff, status effects, Minor Brittle, how we proc Minor Brittle, how we proc Chilled, who's going to apply Minor Brittle, and situations where Minor Brittle is going to be procced by the tank. So let's get straight into it. So the Ice Staff is quite a useful weapon option for tanking. The main reason tanks use a staff in the first place is for the ability to wield a two-handed weapon and activate a full weapon glyph. With a one-handed weapon, your weapon glyph only has half the value. The Frost Staff, in particular, has a passive which increases your damage mitigation while using a staff and taking damage as well. This makes Frost Staves a much safer option when tanking, as you can actually take some damage when holding the staff, and you're not going to take a great deal amount of extra damage compared to using a shield. The Frost Staff is much more defensive and will help you survive heavy attacks and mechanics compared to other two-handed weapons. You will take more damage than when using a shield, so you will have to play a little bit more carefully, but generally the Ice Staff is a tank weapon and you are able to absorb damage on this bar without dying. So Ice Staff versus Lightning Staff. So Lightning Staves are typically used for providing a group DPS increase, and this is applied by concussion and off balance, and the Exploiter CP passive. This is almost always fully covered by the healers, as they typically use Lightning Staffs, maintain blockade, and use a charge shock front bar. This means between two healers they can fully maintain concussion and off balance uptime without the need for the tanks to actually use a Lightning Staff as well. It's a bit overkill using 3 or 4 Lightning Staves in a group, you just don't need it. For ad pulls it's still worth using a Lightning Staff as a tank because there are a range of enemies, and stacking lightning when there are a number of enemies will help push the concussion and off balance faster so the ads can die faster. For boss fights it's both safer to use ice and unnecessary to use lightning when you have 2 healers that are doing so already. So let's have a look at the Frost Staff skills and perks. So first of all we have got Crushing Shock. Now this is a damage based skill, more used by damage dealers, not often used by tanks. We do use the Crushing Shock more, and this is because it's a ranged interrupt. This ability also causes frost damage, and this is going to be potentially a skill that you might use to help increase your Minor Brittle and your Chilled effect because it is applying frost damage, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. We've also got Elemental Blockade. Now Elemental Blockade is a 14-second duration ability that tanks usually keep on their back bar, and this is generally used for proccing your back bar enchant. So often tanks will use an infused Crusher on their back bar, they put down Blockade, and for the 14 seconds that's there, that will keep proccing the Crusher enchant over and over again on cooldown. And this is one of the main reasons why tanks use a staff, for this long duration AoE ability that will keep proccing different enchants and also a full enchant. With Blockade of Frost, you also immobilize chilled enemies, so this can be good for certain classes such as the Templar who don't have a class-based root or immobilization skill. And also you grant yourself and allies a damage shield which absorbs projectiles. So when you cast Blockade, you put a shield around yourself and 5 other allies in your group as well, or 5 other people nearby. And this will absorb projectiles, so this will help with absorbing some projectile damage if you're in certain content where there's projectiles hitting your group. This will help to reduce some of the incoming damage. Next we've got Destructive Clench. With this skill it will cause elemental damage for whatever staff you're using, so if you're using a Frost Staff it will cause frost damage. It will also immobilize the enemies and taunt the enemies. Now this isn't a very good skill to use against ranged allies, because if you are in a dungeon and you taunt an enemy with this that is at range, you'll immobilize them in place, and something that you don't want to do is immobilize enemies away from you. Generally, in most content, ranged enemies want to be pulled into a stack, so it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to have an immobilization on this skill. I think it was they've really overlooked how this skill works by putting immobilization onto a taunt when actually you want to be pulling stuff in and then rooting it in place when it's stacked. This taunt is also not as good as in a rage. It's got a 15-meter radius on it. It's only got a range of 15 meters. Inner range has got 28 meters. So this isn't as good. The only upside to using this is if you are the person who is maintaining Brittle, is this is going to help you maintain the Brittle uptime by using this taunt because of the frost damage that it does. Again, we'll talk about this in a short while, but that would be the only reason you might consider using this skill. Other skills we might use is attack. We've got Elemental Drain, which causes major breach, reducing physical and spell resistance. So you might use this if you are using double Frost Staff, for example. And it also causes minor magic steal, which returns magicka to people when they do damage to the enemy. Finally, we've got Impulse. When we've got an Ice Staff, we provide a minor protection. This also does elemental damage based on what staff you're using, so in this case it'd be frost damage. So this will help maintain your Brittle uptime as well if you use it and every time you apply damage to the enemies. So the Trifocus passive now. When you fully charge Frost Staff Heavy Attack, you create a damage shield around yourself that absorbs 5,627 damage, so another damage shield. So this could be quite handy if you are double Frost Staff tanking, a little bit of extra safety. However, it does require a heavy attack, and it does take quite a long time for a fully charged heavy attack to actually go off and hit the enemy. So it's an option, but something that you might not do very often. Also, while a Frost Staff is equipped, blocking costs magicka instead of stamina. So if you are using a double Frost Staff, this might be something that you need to use for blocking with magicka in the situation where you have no way of generating stamina back if you're using two Frost Staffs. Penetrating Magic, something that you don't really need for a tank, but it will ignore the enemy's spell resistance when you use a Destruction Staff skill. Elemental Force, important one, increases the chance to apply elemental status effects by 100%. So with a Frost Staff, we want to try and apply Chilled, and when we apply Chilled, we get minor Brittle. So we need to have this passive to help maintain and keep the uptime ticking and affecting the enemy with that status. Ancient Knowledge, so equipping a Frost Staff reduces the cost of blocking by 36% and increases the amount of damage you can block by 20%. Now this is why the Frost Staff is a tank weapon potentially, is because you can take damage with a Frost Staff because of the Ancient Knowledge passive, and this is what makes it a tank weapon, you see. Destruction Expert, this is important again. So when you kill an enemy with the Destruction Staff ability, you restore 3,600 magicka. That's not the part that's important for us. We're not really going to be killing many enemies, but we are going to be creating damage shields. So when you absorb damage using a Destruction Staff damage shield, you restore 1,800 magicka. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. Now, we are getting a shield every time we cast Blockade, and if we heavy attack, so we are going to get magicka back every time we absorb damage when we've used those ways of getting a shield. What's also good is if your damage dealers or your group members also have this passive, and you proc your shield on them, when they consume their shield, they'll gain magicka back. So this is actually a group sustain tool. By you using Blockade with a Frost Staff, you also give your group magicka back every 10 seconds with this passive, because they are consuming a Destruction Staff damage shield and gaining magicka back because of you giving them the shield with a Destruction Staff. So this is a good way to add a little bit more sustain to your group, especially if you've got two tanks running Frost Blockade and giving the group shields constantly, and you're in a fight where there's quite a bit of projectile damage hitting your group. Frost Staff status effects. So there's kind of the main status effect you get from a Frost Staff is the Chilled effect. Now, Chilled is a debilitating effect caused by frost damage. When an enemy is chilled, they can be immobilized by Wall of Frost, and chilled enemies are also inflicted with minor maim, reducing their damage done by 5%, and minor Brittle, increasing the crit damage done to them by 10%. Minor Brittle is a effect that is applied. It's a debuff that's applied to the enemy that is chilled. This requires the person applying it to be using a Frost Staff and be on the Frost Staff when the chilled effect is inflicted. If you were on your one-handed shield bar when the enemy gets chilled, they wouldn't get the minor Brittle. You have to be on the actual Frost Staff when the chilled effect is applied for it to also apply minor Brittle. If you are on a bar with a different weapon, one-handed shield for instance, you are unable to inflict minor Brittle on the enemy. You must be on the Frost Staff when causing the chill effect, or else minor Brittle will not be inflicted on the enemy. Minor Maim is still inflicted, however. Just a quick note on Minor Brittle. There is currently a bug in the game. This video has been recorded on the 18th of November 2020. So beyond this point, there might be a fix in the game. There might be some kind of fix. I don't know if it's intended or if it's a bug. But if you have Heroic Slash, which causes Minor Maim applied on the enemy, you cannot apply Minor Brittle to an enemy that has already got Minor Maim applied to them. So there is some kind of interlink with Minor Brittle and Minor Maim, and when you cause Minor Maim via Heroic Slash, it prevents Minor Brittle from working. So in groups at the moment, it's not advised to use Heroic Slash, or else you are not able to get Minor Brittle. This may be patched in the future though, like I say. It could be a bug, it might be intended, we don't actually know at this point. So beyond this point now, if there is a fix in the future, you can again use Heroic Slash. But at this current period right now, for me, Heroic Slash isn't being used because it's meaning that Minor Brittle cannot be applied to an enemy. So what is Minor Brittle? Minor Brittle is a 4-second debuff applied to a target which increases the amount of critical damage they take by 10%. To apply this debuff, you need to be wielding an Ice Staff and cause the chilled effect whilst holding the Ice Staff. If you proc chilled while wielding any other weapon, you only apply Minor Maim, and the Minor Brittle does not get applied. So how do we proc chilled and how do we proc Minor Brittle? So we've got to cause the chilled status effect, and the chilled status effect is what causes Minor Brittle to be applied to an enemy. So to cause the chilled status effect, you essentially need to layer frost damage on the enemy. And the easiest way to cause an enemy to be chilled is by using a charged Frost Staff, using Frost Enchants, using Blockade of Frost, or using an Asylum Frost Staff. So one way to apply Chilled and Brittle is to use 2 Frost Staves, with the back bar being a Frost Enchant and any trait, it doesn't matter, and the front bar to be a charged weapon with any enchant. What happens is you place Blockade on your back bar, and then when you move on to your charged front bar, the Blockade and the enchant will constantly proc the chilled status effect, almost always on cooldown. So as you can see there, it's constantly proccing. Every single time. And that's with a Frost Enchant on the back bar and a charged weapon on the front bar. Another way to set this up would be using a infused Crusher on the back bar as normal, which is a kind of standard tank thing to do. And then using a charged Frost front bar. To proc the chilled effect now, you would either use a Destruction Staff skill such as Frost Clench, Force Shock or Light Attack. Doing any of these will proc your Frost Enchant, which will then cause the chilled effect to the target who's also being damaged by your Blockade of Frost. So we've got our Blockade on the ground, and we're using a front bar skill to proc our enchant. Using a front bar Frost Staff that is charged Frost, and Frost Clench to taunt, procs chilled and Minor Brittle almost every time. As you do frost damage from the clench and you proc your enchant both at the same time, so this causes the effect to happen. So when we use our taunt, it activates Minor Brittle almost every single time because we're using frost damage from the ability and it's proccing our enchant on cooldown. So it works almost every single time. Whenever we cast our taunt, it will reapply it. And finally, using the Asylum Frost Staff will give you the maximum possible guarantee to proc Chilled and Minor Brittle. So every second cast of Force Shock will always apply Burning, Concussion and Chilled status effects. That is the part there. You've got to cast it within 2 seconds. So when you cast 2 Force Shocks, it's guaranteed to proc Chilled. This isn't ideal for a tank having to use 2 Force Shocks every 4 seconds. But if you combine it with Frost Blockade and Frost Glyph procs, then you can have your Asylum Frost Staff as a failsafe to guarantee a chilled proc if it isn't activating. So if you've noticed that it's dropped off on the enemy and you want to guarantee and get that proc on there, you can just run over and double tap it, double hit your force shock, and that's going to guarantee that the enemy gets it every time. So it's more of an option to use as a failsafe. So when Brittle isn't applying from everything else, you can just proc it with your force shock. Now, stats effects typically have certain proc chances and proc rates, but with Minor Brittle and Chilled, it's quite easy to just keep down blockade, and if you've got a charged frost front bar, when you light attack, it'll proc your enchant, and that will activate Brittle on the enemy just by light attacking. So this can be quite good if you're in a situation where your main tank has got ice blockade on the enemy, and then let's say you've got to kite a boss. You can be light attacking while kiting, and that's going to cause the chilled effect. So in situations where you might have to kite a boss, you can make sure that the main tank has got blockade on the boss, and then you just need to cause a light attack to proc the chilled effect. So who is going to apply Brittle? That is the big question. It's going to vary from group to group. It's going to vary based on the group's experience and the individual experience of the group as well. So the tank's experience and all that kind of stuff. For lower end progression level raiding groups, it's almost certainly going to be the job of a damage dealer. The only reason for this is that they're going to be activating Minor Brittle automatically and naturally just by doing a normal damage rotation. So it's completely automatic. They're just doing the rotation, they're activating Chilled and Brittle, and it's very, very easy for them to do so. The problem is, however, that they do lose quite a lot of damage from what I've seen of people testing so far. A damage dealer will lose around 10k DPS by using double frost staff. So while they can maintain a good uptime, it can be an issue for groups if they're losing 10k DPS and they're not gaining more than that back from the other damage dealers that are getting the benefit of the Minor Brittle effect. In this level of group, you would typically have 2 healers and 2 full tanks. It's unlikely that the support group would be comfortable enough to maintain a worthwhile uptime of Minor Brittle as well. So that is the downside of putting it on a support in that sort of group, in that beginner level, lower end progression group, is the support roles are usually heavily focused on mechanics and survival and healing, and it's unlikely that they would be able to maintain a good Brittle uptime to make it worthwhile using it on one of those roles. In more experienced groups, it's likely you will have the buff healer maintaining Brittle in any situation where both tanks are occupied and unable to apply a reliable uptime of Brittle. It's not always going to fall to the healers, however. It's only going to be something that might be used in situations where tanks can't do it. Tanks can apply Brittle and Chilled, and it's likely to be the tank's job in most upper tier kind of trial groups. There are a lot of situations where this is going to fall to the off tank to apply, as they typically have more situations where they can either run a double frost staff setup, or they can sit on their ice staff bar proccing the debuff because they're going through much lower damage phases. They can sit on their back bar and they can apply debuffs and set up themselves a little bit differently so they can maintain that from their back bar. There are also some situations where a main tank can get a good reliable uptime by either using double frost or sitting on the back bar as well. Since you only need to use 2 lightning staves in a group to maintain concussion and off balance, this is a job that should typically fall to the healers. Ice staves are basically a tank weapon that provides benefits that help a tank, so it makes sense for tanks to be the ones using an ice staff wherever possible. It works well, potentially, to have the healers using an infused crusher lightning stave, and it will allow both tanks to then use a charged frost ice staff. Now this is especially going to be useful in a situation where the tanks can only run an ice staff back bar and they're still going to use a one-handed shield front bar. This would mean that the tanks need to use a charged frost ice staff to maintain any reliable source of Minor Brittle, which then means that the infused crusher would have to fall to the healers to make this worthwhile doing. What happens by doing this is both tanks maintain blockade, and when dealing with low damage, low mechanic phases of fights, they can play long parts of the fight on their ice staff bar. Between 2 tanks, keeping down blockade and playing as much on the back bar as possible, it's actually quite comfortable for them to play using this method and keep a good uptime as well between them. There's not many situations in trials where both tanks are 100% tied up with mechanics and dealing with damage. So this is an option for them to sit on the back bar and switch their bars around slightly. So for example, on a DK, you might put stagger onto your back bar and then play on your Ice Staff more while also maintaining stagger, because all you've got to do is keep down the charge frost blockade with the frost glyph. That will keep proccing while you do stagger as well, so you can maintain buffs from your back bar, and you use your front bar mainly for taunting and dealing with those heavy damage mechanic phases. So where can tanks reliably maintain chilled and minor brittle? So for Kind's Aegis, it would definitely be a double frost staff off tank for the whole trial. This trial is pretty much a one tank trial for the most part, where the main tank will take most enemies and most damage. You can quite comfortably take a double frost staff off tank, with also the main tank running a frost staff single bar and keeping down that frost blockade to help with the uptime. So in Sunspire, you've got the Locustes fight, and it's possible that the main tank, they could run a 1-bar Asylum staff where they're able to maintain Brittle on the boss with the Asylum staff, and then on their front bar, they've still got their sword and board for reflecting back the damage. For Yolnahkriin, both tanks can use a single bar Ice Staff back bar. There are quite a lot of phases where the off tank will have some adds, but if the main tank's got blockade down, the off tank can be light attacking the boss, and the main tank can also sit on the back bar for some good phase of the fight until there is a Dragon Breath. And then for Navintas, if you're not doing hard mode, obviously the off tank can just run a double frost staff. If you are doing hard mode, the main tank can play the majority of this fight on the back bar until they get them marked for death and the Dragon's Breath, at which point they would have to switch to the front bar. So you would have some minor downtime with just the tank only applying it. But you could have one of the healers maybe also using a single frost staff, and between the healer and the tank doing it, you'd be able to get a reasonable uptime. For Cloud Rest, off-tanking this with a double frost staff setup is quite easy. The mini-bosses don't do a whole lot of damage, so the only damage that you get from the mini-bosses can be dodge rolled, so the heavy attacks can be dodge rolled. So using a double frost staff off-tank for Cloud Rest is 100% the way to go for this, and it's very, very easy to do. You just dodge roll the heavy attacks, and it's almost no damage for the off tank in this situation. For Asylum Sanctorium, you can actually double frost staff main tank this fight. You would have to roll dodge all of the swipes, but it's not out of the question to do double frost staff main tank in here. If you are going to eat some of the light attacks from the boss, it's probably better not to play with a double frost staff, although you can take the swipes with a frost staff because you have got that extra 20% damage that you can block with the Ancient Knowledge passive. So you can tank this with double frost staff, you can take hits, but it's better to dodge roll if you are going to do so. If you're not going to double frost staff this fight, the main tank would probably still apply it, and it would be quite easy for them to sit on the back bar for most part of this fight. The boss hits every 5 seconds, so even if you don't play double frost and you just play single bar frost for Asylum Sanctorium, it's not going to be too difficult because one hit every 5 seconds means you are going to be on your back bar quite a considerable amount of time if you need to be. Halls of Fabrications, so boss 1's the only tricky one really, because if you do the fight where you have the main tank at the entrance with one of the bosses and the off tank in the middle of the room with the other boss, the main tank can play most of this fight on their back bar. It's not a huge damage fight. So you could play a single bar main tank where they sit on the bar as much as possible. For boss 2 and 3, you would just go with the double frost off tank. The off tank can just light attack from around the edges of the arena and keep a good uptime on the main boss, especially on boss 2. And then on boss 3, the main tank would take the adds and the off tank would just debuff the boss. On boss 4, both tanks would just play a single frost build where they sit on the back bar. This is again a low damage situation until they're in the middle. When they're in the middle, you can just dodge roll the heavy attacks, which you should be doing anyway. So it is quite possible that you could just single bar Ice Staff and sit on the back bar as much as possible. And then for last boss, a double frost staff off tank is quite a comfortable thing to do. If you're playing super safe and pulling adds and having to hold a whole bunch of adds, then potentially just run both tanks with a single bar Ice Staff, and that would work also. For more of Lorcash, the off tank has almost no damage to deal with. They've got one of the twins to deal with on the second boss. And on the last boss they have the hulks. Now, both of those things don't really do much damage at all. If you've set up as a tank with enough health and heavy armor, using a frost staff compared to a shield is almost unnoticeable in this situation. So the off tank should probably do a double frost staff for the entire trial in More of Lorcash. For Sanctum Ophidia, this one's a bit of a tricky trial where the tanks are sometimes separating, pulling together. So both tanks using a single frost staff bar and sitting on the back bar as much as possible would work for this one. For Hellra, you'd use a double frost off tank for the whole trial. You don't actually really need an off tank until the last boss hard mode. You would have to probably put this on a healer if you're only using one tank, because on the first boss there's going to be phases where the main tank can't go onto the back bar during the main boss's spin mechanic, and on the last boss during the 1000 cuts it's going to be difficult for the main tank to maintain the back bar situation. So it would probably fall to a healer in this particular thing unless you are using an off tank. And then finally for Ethereal Archive, you would just have a double frost main tank for all bosses except the last boss, and then on the last boss you'd use a single frost staff build. And if you use my build from thetankclub.com, where you've got a lot of time that you can spend and bar swap quite comfortably, very safe build where you use potion boost with immovable potions, it's not going to be out of the question to be bar swapping regular to keep down Brittle and Chilled. So just to recap, Chilled is an important stats effect that causes the debuff Minor Brittle, which is going to increase group DPS. For a damage dealer to use an Ice Staff, it means they're going to lose quite a lot of DPS, and it would be good to let both tanks use Ice Staves since it is typically a tank weapon. And there are lots of situations where maintaining the debuff as a tank is not difficult. The biggest challenge for tanks is going to be the complete overhaul in their play style. Things are going to have to change. Tanks are going to have to figure out how to play in a different way. Sitting on the back bar could become quite confusing. Playing double frost staff could be difficult to tanks that are used to playing with a one-hand and shield. So you are going to have to allow your tanks to learn and practice and get used to tanking in a different way, because this is a very, very different playstyle. It means you're going to be tanking in an entirely different method, and builds are going to have to be adjusted to work with this kind of setup as well. So while it is definitely going to be something a tank can maintain and can do and should do where possible, you are going to have to allow your tanks to get used to dealing with fights with this type of setup. Minor Brittle is a short duration debuff that requires a lot of attention to maintain, but with one of the setups we've mentioned and displayed today, and it will become easier once you've given your tanks time to practice and get used to tanking more with Frost Staves and playing with the Frost Staff on the main bar. So thank you all for watching. If you've got any questions at all about the Chilled stats effect, Ice Staves or Minor Brittle, please leave a comment below. Or you can drop me a message in the Tank Club Discord. You can find the link for that in the description below also. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.